Are you just a little bit weird? When you were a kid, did other kids make fun of you for some supposedly weird thing about you that really isn't even that weird in retrospect? Maybe you have freckles or frizzy hair, which just means you have a curl pattern, or glasses, or you're really tall, or really short, or neurodivergent, or queer, which kids can apparently pick up on, or have some other thing about you that stands out that put you on the receiving end of antagonistic comments as a child. Whatever the case is, I assume you're not completely average and are at least just a little bit weird or outside the norm because the average person simply doesn't exist. In fact, the idea that there's such a thing as the average or normal human wasn't even adopted until the 19th century and has been disproven numerous times. Yet it continues to permeate the public consciousness as if it were some timeless concept. In this video essay, I'm going to debunk the utility of the concept of averageness and attempt to answer some questions, mostly using information from Robert Chapman's fantastic book, Empire of Normality. How did this normality paradigm come to be? Who does it serve? And what can we do about it? Normality is viewed both as something to aspire to if you want respect, but also something that people intentionally avoid to attract attention or fulfill some secret agenda. You can see this view reflected in comments like, if queer people want to be accepted as normal, then just be normal, don't make it your entire personality. Or, all these people on TikTok are faking their autism and ADHD for attention. Stop trying to feel special when you're just normal. Or, media about people who aren't cishet white men is the woke agenda at work because Brad over here with the khakis and the gray polo is the peak of human normality, and every video game and movie and everything should be about him. Because to those people, other people who are outside of the general conception of what they deem to be average simply don't exist. But actually, it's normality and averageness that doesn't truly exist. They're not very useful concepts, but they keep sticking around because it's useful to some people and to a particular ideology that we'll talk about later. 1. The average person does not exist. In the late 1940s, the US Air Force started to become acutely aware of how averages don't exist and aren't particularly useful when its pilots kept losing control of their planes, leading to as many as 17 crashes in a single day at one point. Of course, the initial blame was put on the pilots for their human error, but the pilots denied that that was the case. I mean, you also can't really blame an individual participating in a system for that system being bad. The real problem was actually the design of the cockpit, which was designed to accommodate the average pilot, whose dimensions were based on the average physical measurements of hundreds of male pilots taken in 1926. In 1950, researchers at Wright Air Force Base in Ohio figured that maybe that average was out of date and maybe pilots were larger now. So they measured over 4,000 pilots on 140 dimensions, including things like thumb length, crotch height, distance from a pilot's ear to eye, and more, then calculated the average, believing that this updated average calculation would create a better fitting cockpit. That is, until Lieutenant Gilbert S. Daniels, inspired by his own undergraduate thesis research in anthropology, used the data he gathered from measuring these pilots to determine if any of them actually were average. He found that of 4,063 pilots, none of them were average on all 10 dimensions that were deemed to be the most relevant for design. Also, if you picked 3 of the 10 dimensions measured, only 3.5% of pilots would be average sized on all 3 dimensions. The average pilot simply did not exist, and designing a cockpit for this average pilot meant designing a cockpit that fit absolutely no one. When Daniels published his findings in a 1952 Air Force technical note entitled "The Average Man?" question mark, he argued that if the military wanted to improve soldier and pilot performance, they would need to redesign the environments they interacted with accordingly. This concept is universal. If you want the individuals within a system to function better, you should redesign the system rather than blaming the individuals who had no say over that system or its faults. That's like what you learn on day one of human factors grad school. I'm low key giving you my master's degree for free here. You're welcome. In his tactical note, Daniels wrote that the tendency to think in terms of the average man is a pitfall into which many persons blunder. It is virtually impossible to find an average airman, not because of any unique traits in this group, but because of the great variability of bodily dimensions, which is characteristic of all men. The military surprisingly embraced his suggestion, probably because the alternative was more plane crashes of unknown origin. So they started designing everything based on the principle of individual fit. Instead of making a cockpit for the average person, Cockpits were designed to fit pilots with measurements within the 5th and 95th percentile on each dimension. This design philosophy was officially formalized in 1967 in the Military Standard 1472 Handbook that I learned a lot about in grad school for human factors engineering. We had to calculate a lot of 95th and 5th percentiles of things. Also, fun fact, completely unrelated to anything. When the military first told airplane manufacturers about this, the airplane manufacturers were like, no, it'll be too expensive to create new planes according to your standards. But the military was like, tough luck, buddy, you gotta do it. So the manufacturers ended up creating cheap and easy to implement solutions pretty quickly. If you like innovation, you should probably know that limitation is the mother of invention, and that innovating to avoid safety issues is a good thing. Much better than like murdering people. Again, not related to anything going on right now at all. Anyway, although I'm obviously not thrilled with the US military or the US in general, boo US military, the way that we design products that people interact with but that are meant to make it easier for soldiers to perform their duties or to make profits can inform the way we design things within a system that has no need for war and no profit motive, and where workers own the means of production and are in charge of the government. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Though this design principle came about specifically to make things easier for the military, designing for the outliers and ensuring that as many people as possible can use a system is clearly just more effective, efficient, and safer than designing for some mythical average that doesn't exist. 2. Health as normality. So now we know that there's no such thing as average and that designing for outliers creates better systems. But if that's the case, why does the myth of averageness and normality persist? In order to answer that, we need to talk about the conditions that gave rise to the concept of normality in the first place. And it all starts with how we view health. For a long time, health was seen as a form of harmony, either within the body or between the body and its environment. In ancient Greece, for example, it was about having a balance of your four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Ayurveda in India, ancient Chinese medicine, ancient Egyptian medicine, Incan oral medicine traditions, and many other ancient societies also had their own conception of health as balance, equilibrium, or harmony. This view persisted under feudalism, which arose from the fall of the Roman Empire, whose growth relied on slavery. Slave revolts led to landlords giving former slaves their own land to live on and till with their families. These newly freed agricultural workers swore fealty to local lords for protection and were able to work their own land. They also had access to common lands and had duties to the lord in exchange for protection. Under feudalism, production levels were relatively low. Most people worked from their homes or on their own land, and there weren't set deadlines or quotas. Instead, people worked together as a family to produce what they needed to sustain themselves and lived slower paced lives with more flexible, self determined hours. Chronic illnesses and disabilities were more accommodated as disabled people could still find ways to contribute to the household. People also worked in relation to the seasons, and health was still thought of as harmony between various factors, including harmony of communities. Then the Black Death wiped out up to a third of the population, and with the new worker shortage, workers rebelled to demand better conditions. Meanwhile, some landowners began making profits from selling their products and accumulating and reinvesting their new wealth. Increased specialization of labor also led to greater production and population growth, and managing this larger population and larger production level required stricter forms of measurement and quantification from the state. This led to the formalization of surnames and standard measurements for measuring harvests and profits, which also coincided with classifications relating to ability, leading to distinctions such as the deserving and undeserving poor who weren't eligible for help from the state. The emerging property relations in Europe were also driven by European colonization of Africa and the Americas, during which Europeans adapted the early racist ideas they held about the Irish and Slavs to justify their genocide and enslavement of indigenous and black people. This led to a new slave trade much more brutal than the Roman Empire slavery, and out of all this, a global capitalist system began to grow. The advent of capitalism coincided with the start of health being seen as normality rather than harmony. This context led up to the Industrial Revolution and the normalization of Cartesian dualist thinking. The idea that the mind and body are completely separate entities and that the body is a machine that can be fixed with proper intervention. Cartesian dualism is absolutely awful. I have a whole video about it. During the Industrial Revolution, the development of new technologies led to labor becoming even more specialized, leading to even higher productivity and profits than ever before. Merchant capitalism transformed into industrial capitalism, and the bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production by definition, were able to invest their profits and accumulate more capital, making them even more wealthy, powerful, and influential than the kings and lords of feudal times. Aside from the aristocrats left over from feudal times, everyone else was now a free worker selling their labor to the capitalists, an enslaved laborer forced to work against their will, or unemployed and part of a new surplus population. Industrial capitalism led to poor living conditions, overcrowding, pollution, new epidemics and diseases, and so on, all of which was already terrible for the human body, and all of which led to the reframing the view of the body as a dynamic organism that could be in and out of balance depending on a number of factors, including the environment, to a machine that was either working or broken depending on whether it could fulfill its productive potential. As machines became standardized, the ideal worker was standardized too. Workers had to be able to travel to the factory and work with the pace and production norms of the industrial workplace. Anyone with an impairment that prevented them from doing so came to be seen as broken, thus cementing able bodiedness as the norm and creating a surplus unemployed population who either couldn't work or had to compete with other workers for employment. Yeah, congrats. If you're unemployed, you're part of the surplus, which capitalism requires. Enslaved workers in the American South were the first to be scientifically studied and manipulated to increase productivity and maximize output and thus profit. This management and study of workers was then expanded to all workers after the slave trade and slavery were outlawed, although the 13th Amendment makes slavery legal as punishment for a crime, so it wasn't really outlawed in the US, but under capitalism, workers were now pitted against each other and forced to compete for employment, and once they were employed, their performance was compared to everyone else's. So if you hate having to do those annoying performance review things at work, blame Descartes and blame the Industrial Revolution. And the French Revolution, too. 3. The glorification of averages. Statistics was originally invented by astronomers in the 16th century, and in 1801, German mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss developed a formula on which he based a bell curve shaped graph, which became known as the error curve, where errors were understood as deviations from the norm. This paved the way for the use of statistical analyses of normality in other fields and associated normality with correctness and abnormality with error. Deviation from the norm was not seen as a good thing. During the French Revolution, this concept of statistical normality was first applied to medicine. The revolution aimed to free humanity from religious dogma and the feudal system, thus creating a new system where everything was quantified and standardized without any of that woo-woo spiritual shit. Honestly, sometimes I think they should bring back the woo. These conditions led to the creation of the metric system, the standardization of weights, map-making surveys, and more things that were purported to be universal and objective. Also, many people perished or were injured or executed during the revolution, which was much longer, more brutal, and bloodier than any of the Russian revolutions, I'm just saying. And because of this, physicians in Paris were able to experiment with applying new statistical ideas to patients' bodies and records. It was in this context that the Belgian statistician Adolphe Quetelet became the first to propose the concept of human normality as a science, and his work and influence still impact our lives today, unfortunately. He was a mathematician, musician, and astronomer, so he was familiar with statistical normality. During the revolution, his observatory was occupied and used as an armory, which disrupted his work and ultimately led him to find ways to apply statistics to humans rather than to celestial bodies. Quetelet sought to quantify and statistically analyze pretty much everything he could about humans and compare those metrics to the larger population. According to Quetelet, the average man was the ideal person, basically the pinnacle of perfection, and anything outside the norm was a monstrosity and a mistake of nature. His viewpoint cemented the idea that being normal or average is good and thus moral and aspirational. Quetelet's viewpoint was very convenient for the bourgeois ruling class, as it provided justification for bourgeois hegemony by glorifying the average, moderation, and the middle way of life. It's good to be in the middle. You should be happy you live a moderate life. The bourgeoisie are doing you a favor by being at the top. Due to Quetelet's influence, people started to be ranked based on their mental abilities, and this ranking was framed as a timeless natural order rather than a new development arising from the material conditions of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, which is what it was. The idea of normality effectively justified and reified the various hierarchies that arose under capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and allowed cognitively abled people to establish a monopoly on the means of production. Intelligence became grounded in statistics rather than in ancient wisdom, thus categorizing middle class, cognitively abled white people as closer to an idealized normal, especially compared to disabled people, working class people, and black and brown colonized subjects. Being considered subnormal became increasingly stigmatized and feared. Quetelet's influence also led to the emergence of various fields that attempted to apply statistical methods to the brain and mind in order to reify capitalist property relations, racial nationalism, and the hierarchies of ability, social class, gender, and race. These fields included phrenology, psychiatry, psychology, and psychometrics, all rooted in a Cartesian understanding of the body as a working or broken machine. Quetelet also inspired Francis Galton, known as the father of eugenics. Galton was obsessed with the concepts of genius and heredity and aimed to study them scientifically. He was also inspired by his cousin Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, believing that since natural selection occurs due to random mutations in the environment that allow organisms to adapt to their environments over time, that means that individuals could be more or less fit than other individuals, which could be framed as them being more evolved. I mean, it makes a lot of sense that this guy invented eugenics. His 1869 book, Hereditary Genius, combined Darwin's theory with Quetelet's statistical methods. He compared heredity among multiple family trees, individuals, and races, judging them in terms of what he called eminence, and creating a ranking system that placed white upper class Europeans and ancient Greeks at the top and black Africans and indigenous Australians at the bottom. He didn't even comment on women because, according to him, women were unlikely to be geniuses. Despite receiving criticism about the fact that he ascribed eminence to average men who were actually helped along by random incidental advantages, he continued his work and created multiple early forms of psychometric and biometric tests, including intelligence tests, and developed numerous devices for testing abilities like reaction times. If you hate standardized testing, blame Galton, because I'm sure he had something to do with those two. Honestly, standardized tests don't even test what they're supposed to test. They just test how good you are at taking a standardized test. But some people are, and that's fine, and some people are not, and that's also fine. Who cares? Galton effectively reified the notion that intelligence and ability is independent from one's environment and has a set value. Unlike Quetelet, who viewed being average as aspirational, Galton viewed being average as something to overcome, especially to avoid racial degeneration. According to Galton, the average was just the middle rather than a form of perfection. He was also the first guy to rank women's attractiveness on a scale of 1 to 10. Ew. And he wasn't a looker himself. I would give him a 3. Look at this guy. He's so mid. Less than mid. Yeah, subnormal, really. I bet he was really annoying in real life, too. Honestly, capitalism rewards the worst people. But anyway, Galton, the first eugenicist, effectively created what Robert Chapman calls the pathology paradigm in their book, Empire of Normality, which, a lot of the info that I just told you about is from. So if you're interested in this, totally read it. It's a great book. The pathology paradigm reified the neurotypical mind as the norm, against which all other minds must be measured, while eugenics proposed that a species or a race can be improved at the group level. I'm using the word reify a lot because there was a lot of reifying going on back then. And made an abstract concept into a real thing doesn't roll off the tongue as well, so lots of reifying going on. 4. Eugenics bad. Psychoanalysis kinda mid? German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin expanded on Galton's eugenicist idea of the biologically normal mind and applied it to psychiatry, pioneering the idea that mental disorders could be categorized as legitimate diseases rooted in biology. The expanding asylum system and the pathology paradigm arising from the conditions of industrial capitalism effectively birthed the discipline of psychiatry, which could frame itself as a scientific medical specialization requiring research and university study. Most psychiatrists until about the 1930s maintained a Krepelinian biological persuasion and worked as asylum keepers, while neurologists were actually the ones responsible for outpatient practice. After World War I, the concept of normalcy was introduced in the US, with Warren Harding's presidential campaign using the slogan, "Return to normalcy," before normalcy was even a term in the dictionary. The cultural foundations led by fields like phrenology, eugenics, Krepelinian psychiatry, and other Galtonian concepts also gave rise to better baby and fitter family contests like cat shows for humans. US universities also taught eugenics classes, and states adopted eugenic policies like forced sterilization of women with intellectual disabilities, especially black women who were seen as a threat to the white race. People with cognitive disabilities weren't allowed to immigrate to the US at all. Mad people were locked away in asylums and subjected to forced restraint, lobotomies, electroconvulsive therapy, and other horrible abuses and violations of bodily autonomy. So, what is the logical conclusion of labeling people whose body minds are outside the norm as undesirable or a threat to society and finding ways to deal with them? It's fascism. The logical conclusion of an ideology that uses Galtonian research methods and frameworks to determine who is worthy of living and reproducing and who is undesirable, which inherently removes people's autonomy, is fascism, which we can see right now. But I won't get into that. In fact, between 1939 and 1945, during World War II, German psychiatrists participated in the selection process for the Nazi eugenics program of involuntary euthanasia and mass murder called Action T4, ultimately killing 70,000 psychiatric patients with carbon monoxide gas. By the end of World War II, between 73 to 100% of all people in Germany who were identified as schizophrenic had either been sterilized or killed, up to 269,500 people. After the Allied victory, thanks primarily to the USSR, support for explicitly eugenic policies and Krepelinian biological psychiatry declined within Western liberal nations, and Freudian psychoanalysis became more popular. Mental illness was no longer seen as a medical defect originating in the brain, but as originating from the family and the social world. Rather than focusing on measuring the mind and one's cognitive abilities from a so called objective standpoint, Freud's approach was more concerned with using talk therapy and analyzing human suffering in relation to unconscious drives, trauma, and early childhood experiences to heal psychological problems. Psychoanalysis reached its peak in the late 1950s and early 1960s. At that point, all major US psychiatry departments appointed psychoanalysts as their chairman, and the majority of psychiatry positions in US academia were held by psychoanalysts. And during that time, psychoanalysis expanded its scope from just dealing with daily problems to dealing with patients who Freud originally considered to not be good candidates for psychoanalysis, like people with schizophrenia or manic depression, which is now known as bipolar disorder, and the like. Then psychoanalysis started to lose its popularity, with some critiquing it for being increasingly dogmatic and extending beyond its proper scope. Psychopharmacological drugs, which started being developed in the 1950s, also became much more advanced in the 1970s and 80s. So now, many problems that were thought to be psychological or psychosocial in origin were now claimed to be caused by chemical imbalances in the brain and treated with pharmaceuticals. Once psychoanalysis fell out of favor, many former psychoanalysts took over asylums without reforming them, effectively becoming complicit in the carceral system that recreated the capitalist hierarchies within itself. People who were unable to be exploited for their labor, or who stood against patriarchal, white supremacist, heteronormative capitalist power relations, were deemed as insane and mentally ill, reinforcing existing forms of social domination. Women were pathologized as hysterical for challenging the patriarchy. Black radicals were pathologized with protest psychosis for resisting racism. Queerness was also viewed as a pathology and a mental illness. Anyone fighting for liberation could now be deemed insane and therefore immoral and in need of fixing and not worth listening to, justifying the removal of their bodily autonomy by incarcerating them in an asylum. 5. Anti-psychiatry. This all gave rise to the anti-psychiatry movement, popularized largely by Thomas Szasz, a psychiatrist himself, with his 1960 article, The Myth of Mental Illness. In it, he argued that mental illness was a metaphor rather than a real medical ailment of biological origin, that talk therapy is simply a form of social support rather than a medical treatment, and that institutionalization was simply a form of social control. He was right about institutionalization being a form of social control, but he missed the part that it stems from the capitalist state wanting to control people whose body minds can't be exploited for profit or who go against the capitalist status quo in some way. According to Saz, it was the mental illness itself rather than the capitalist status quo giving rise to the social control of mental illness patients. Saz didn't challenge the concept of normality at all, but instead claimed that there is no such thing as mental illness and that rather than being a deviation from the physical norm, mental illness was simply a deviation from the psychosocial and ethical norm. He also believed that so called mentally ill people were actually idlers who refused to take responsibility. Typical right wing libertarian bullshit, let's be real. Marxists and anti fascists like Franco Basaglia and the West German Socialist Patients Collective rejected this approach, arguing that mental illness is in fact an illness, but one caused primarily by capitalist domination and oppression. However, other self proclaimed communists like David Cooper, who coined the term anti psychiatry, actually endorsed Saz's view. Meanwhile, Saz's anti psychiatry stance was heavily inspired by Friedrich Hayek, the father of neoliberalism. The privatize everything, defund social programs, create the conditions for the existence of an unemployed surplus population deemed undesirable, then blame people for falling into that surplus population or for struggling to retain their place in the non surplus population approach to structuring society. It's not going well. This created a weird alliance between right wing libertarian anti psychiatry proponents and leftists fighting for liberation, both of whom supported the dissolution of state hospitals and the closing of the asylums. The right wing libertarian side hated funding any sort of social programs and wanted to close the asylums so all those mentally ill idlers could stop leeching off of society, while the left wing side opposed the incarceration of the mentally ill in these inhumane prison like conditions. Deinstitutionalization, or the transfer of mentally ill people from public or private facilities into their communities and homes, was first called for by early neoliberal politician Enoch Powell and turned into a widespread policy by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the UK and President Ronald Reagan in the US. Slogans like community care and the replacement of the mental hospital masked the fact that what was actually happening was that services for mentally ill people were being reduced under these neoliberal policies, which were now framed as being a good supportive thing. And with deinstitutionalization, rather than it leading to more community care, the number of homeless and imprisoned mentally ill people actually rapidly increased. Because these people who were incapable of being exploited by capitalists for profit and whose families couldn't care for them because they had to go to work basically had nowhere to go. The closing of the asylums also led to an expansion of the prison industrial complex, which started to incarcerate white former inmates of asylums and, in much greater numbers, mad or disabled black people. Many former asylums have also been converted to or replaced with prisons. Older mad people were shifted to nursing homes, which have their own issues and are also carceral and abusive. Mad people locked up in psychiatric facilities against their will were subjected to abuse, forced restraint, and other violations of bodily autonomy. And both of these things are still the case today. Although the Sazian perspective was that the closing of the asylums would lead to the liberation of mentally ill people who were unfairly institutionalized as a form of social control for what he considered essentially a fake problem or a non problem. But it turns out that privatizing social services doesn't actually lead to liberation. No surprise there. Sass's viewpoint was incredibly idealistic. He believed that the power for psychiatric control came from the belief in ideas about psychiatry rather than being rooted in a material basis, a need for the social control of those who cannot be exploited by capitalism. So he believed that closing the asylums would bring liberation. Magically. The shift from asylum to prison incarceration for mad people was also an okay outcome for Saz rather than a negative side effect of his perspective. The closing of the asylums didn't bring liberation for those deemed abnormal or undesirable by society, or even reduce the incidence of mental illness. And in fact, homelessness and the expansion of the prison industrial complex also generate madness and mental illness. So that's a whole thing. Our collective mental health has obviously declined since the shift to neoliberalism, with more and more people reporting that they are stressed out, anxious, depressed, whatever, with pretty much every passing year. More and more people are seeking privatized solutions like therapy to deal with the stressors of everyday life under late stage capitalism, and more people are taking psychopharmacological drugs just to feel somewhat okay. Just about everyone hates their job, most people in the US live paycheck to paycheck and struggle to pay their bills. The US backed Zionist occupation is committing a genocide of the indigenous Palestinian population, and there's multiple other genocides occurring in the global south. And those of us in the global north are more lonely and isolated than ever before, and growing more aware of how our lifestyles here in the global north are propped up by the exploitation of the global south. And thanks to neoliberalism, the stress, anxiety, depression, and so on that individuals feel as a result of all that is blamed on the individuals themselves for not working hard enough to fix their abnormal, broken body minds. When really it should be blamed on the neoliberal capitalist system that produces those things. Unity through uniqueness. Rather than pathologizing those outside of the mythical average and catering to an average human that doesn't exist, society should be built around serving the most vulnerable people and the outliers. In fields like user experience design and human factors engineering, you learn that you don't design products for the average because if you do, you'll end up with garbage products that aren't usable for anyone and potentially lead to terrible things like plane crashes. To design products that work for the largest number of people possible, you need to think about the extreme users who will potentially have the hardest time working with that product and making it as usable as possible for them. Like, look at the curb cut effect. Curb cuts that accommodate wheelchair users also make life easier for rollerbladers, cyclists, people with strollers, people on scooters, people with limited leg mobility, and so on. This design principle of designing for outliers to create better systems applies at the level of large scale systems too, meaning that building society for the people who our current eugenicist society deems abnormal and undesirable would actually make society way better. Because again, there is no average, and designing for the average does not yield good outcomes. We are all weird and unique and different, and that is our strength as human beings. We are not here to get lost in the homogenized mind that has been labeled as reasonable, moral, and aspirational by the white cishet eugenicist men who created these systems we live under. Upholding reason and valuing normality simply means upholding that status quo. Do you like the status quo? I assume if you made it this far, you probably don't. And if you do, then why? Are you okay? You have bad taste? But if you don't like the status quo, then embrace who you are as an individual and stop trying to be something you are not. Especially because those of us who are labeled abnormal often have the greatest insights into the faults and contradictions of a society not built for us. And knowing the contradictions of society is an important step towards imagining a better future and resolving those contradictions. It was my boy Oscar Wilde, who was a socialist, by the way, that said, be yourself, everyone else is already taken, and that under socialism people could be their true selves. World building is a part of revolution. You do not just fight against something and aim to destroy the existing structures with no plan on how to replace them. That's not going to get you anywhere. My camera just died, and then I looked in the mirror, and it turns out my eyelash had come unglued between the time that I set up my camera and started filming. The disrespect. What better video to have a fucked up eyelash in than one about normality, so I could be like, look at me, I look weird. Because my eyelash is coming unglued. Anyway, you do not just fight against something and aim to destroy the existing structures with no plan on how to replace them. You need to envision a better world and fight for that world. So, what is the future that your uniqueness inspires you to fight for? Let me know in the comments below because I'm legitimately curious. Or leave me your favorite cat emoji. Or both. Thanks for watching! If you like this video, please subscribe, give it a like, and maybe share it with a friend if you feel compelled. All of that really helps support my channel. Also, I put out new videos every other Sunday, and I also have an Instagram and a TikTok. You're into that sort of thing. If you want to support my work, you can also send me a one-time donation to my tip jar on PayPal or Ko-fi. I'm also working on setting up a Patreon, but I'd like to know what sort of perks people are interested in, like art prints, stickers, Q&As, live streams, a book club, shoutouts at the end of my videos. Let me know if you're interested in that. Also, I asked in a poll I posted a few days ago if you all consider yourselves normal or not, and the majority of people voted that they're weird AF or that normality isn't even real, man. I don't know how representative that is of everyone who watches my videos, but it's cool that a lot of y'all figured out the thesis of this video ahead of time, even though I guess my options gave it away, but still. It was also cool reading everyone's comments. There were some really good insights in there, and I'm going to shout out two that I think fit very well with what this video is about. Sleepy Sheepy 6517 wrote, I stopped caring about what was normal a long time ago. That may make me weird, but what is considered normal is so context based and fluctuates with time and location that it's essentially non existent. Billy Boo 2864 wrote, "Society defines what is normal, and I don't fit what I believe that definition is." Could be wrong, obviously, and in certain ways I'm the most normal person ever. Lol. But in general, I'm pretty weird. I mean, a lot of my uninterestingly normal aspects are masks in some way anyway, but to some extent, I guess normalcy is the mask. Like, there is no normal, just everyone's expectations of what normal is. So, there you have it. Normality isn't even real, man. Anyway, bye for now. See you next time. Like, is there anything more cunt than blue eyeshadow? No. But you know what's not cunt? Having a fucked up eyelash. It's fine. I'll get over it.